The last warmth of early autumn clung to the edges of the Ardennes forest when Private Samuel Huxley stepped out of the maintenance tent with the rifle that had become a joke among his own brothers-in-arms. The Springfield M1903, once elegant in its simplicity, now bore the marks of his stubborn devotion. A hand-fitted bolt smoothed with sandpaper stolen from a supply crate, a firing pin he'd refiled by lantern light, a trigger group polished with oil that smelled like rust and desperation. The men in his platoon called it Huxley's Frankenstein, or sometimes just Huxley's folly, because anyone foolish enough to trust a rifle that had already failed inspection twice had to be clinging to optimism in its most delusional form. Their laughter followed him like shadows, harmless on the surface, but sharp enough that even now, months later, each memory felt like a small cut along a scar he never let. What they didn't understand was that the rifle had belonged to his father, or at least a rifle just like it, a Springfield carried across the broken fields of the last war by a man who came home missing 3 fingers, and the trust that the world would ever be quiet again. Samuel had grown up listening to the clatter of kitchen drawers, slammed repeatedly in frustration, to the long pauses where his father would stare at his hand as though the missing parts still throbbed. The stories came only on rare nights, carried on the bitter scent of whiskey and regret. From those fragments, Samuel learned that rifles weren't machines. They were companions, promises, and sometimes the only pieces of order left in a life that lost its shape too quickly. So when the army shoved a standard-issue M1 Garand into his hands, heavy and impersonal, he felt nothing. But the Springfield, with its rich wood stock and stubborn bolt, made something in his chest settle into place, like the clicking of a lock he hadn't realized existed. He insisted on carrying one, and when the quartermaster gave him a defective piece, Samuel refused to surrender it. Instead, he rebuilt it, night after night, while the men around him slept. The platoon's encampment at the edge of the forest was a place made of damp earth, smoky breath, and the metallic anticipation of something terrible moving quietly in the distance. The German lines were too near, too alive, and the silence between distant artillery rumbles felt more threatening than the explosions themselves. Samuel's unit had been tasked with holding a narrow ridge overlooking a field broken by craters and thin stands of trees, a place the map labelled simply as Hill 43. It was a poor excuse for land to die over, but the war no longer cared about meaning, and men were dying for far less than hills these. Sergeant Cole, whose voice could crack stone, told Samuel that relying on his repaired Springfield was the kind of stupidity that could get a man killed, and more importantly, could get others killed as well. Cole had seen a lot of soldiers come and go, and he'd learned to spot the ones whose desire to prove themselves grew heavier than their ability to survive. Samuel didn't argue. Arguments required certainty, and certainty was something he rarely carried. But the rifle, flawed as it was, responded to him with a whisper of possibility every time he worked the bolt. That was enough. On the morning of the day that would split every memory he carried into before and after, fog draped itself thickly across the ridge. Men moved through it like ghosts, and the distant sound of trucks shifting gears far behind German lines signaled movement, troop movement, armor movement, something that made the officers' shoulders stiffen. Rumor spread quickly. A probing attack, a flanking patrol, a desperate German push to reclaim lost ground before winter sealed the front into ice and futility. The truth didn't matter. What mattered was that the air tasted like the minutes before a storm, charged and waiting. Samuel positioned himself near a fallen pine tree, whose bark had been stripped by shrapnel on 3 sides. From here, he had a clean view through a gap in the trees, a downward angle onto the open field. His Springfield lay across his knees, the familiar weight grounding him. The mockery of his fellow soldiers drifted back in fragments, echoing through his skull. They'd bet chocolate rations and cigarettes on when the rifle would jam next. They joked that if he ever fired it in battle, the Germans would die laughing before any bullets reached them. But none of that mattered as he eased the bolt open, feeling the subtle glide he had created with nights of quiet labor. Calm washed across him in a slow, deliberate wave. As the fog thinned, the first German helmets emerged from the tree line across the field, scattered at first, then forming into the unmistakable pattern of an advancing patrol. Samuel inhaled, steady and deep, letting the cold air fill the hollow places inside him. The rifle waited, and for the first time since the war began, Samuel felt ready. The fog burned away in streaks of pale light as the sun rose higher, turning the wet leaves into mirrors that flashed briefly before fading. The German patrol spread across the field with quiet, mechanical purpose, their movements sharp and deliberate, the discipline of men who had done this too many times to question the cruelty of the pattern. Samuel watched through his scope, his breath slow and measured, the barrel resting on the torn pine bark. There were 12 of them that he could count, maybe more beyond the tree line, their rifles slung loosely over their shoulders, their helmets gleaming faintly. They advanced without haste, scanning the ridge with the slow suspicion of hunters who believed they already knew where the prey would break. Behind him, the platoon stirred, murmurs, a few scattered curses, the clatter of magazines being checked and bolts drawn back. Sergeant Cole moved along the line, his voice a low growl carried by the order was to hold fire until the enemy reached to let them come close enough. The advantage would be absolute. It was the kind of decision that sounded wise in theory, but Samuel could feel his stomach tighten. The Germans were too clean, too quiet, their spacing too precise. They were not wandering aimlessly, they were advancing with a reason. He adjusted his scope again, feeling the old, faint stiffness in the bolt as it locked into place. The rifle was his own creation now, its soul, half steel, half stubbornness, and the world beyond his sights shrank into a single heartbeat. He could see the lead soldier's face, pale and young beneath the rim of his helmet. For a moment, the boy's expression flickered into clarity, something like curiosity, not fear. Then the order came down the line, a sharp whisper that cut through everything. Hold. The seconds stretched into an agony of stillness. Samuel's finger brushed the trigger, not enough to fire, only enough to feel the weight of it. He imagined the laughter again, the jokes, the quiet smirks that had followed him since the day he'd refused to abandon the Springfield. Every click, every failed test, every warning from the armorers replayed in his mind. And yet, here it was, solid, ready, alive. When the first German raised his hand, signaling something unseen behind the trees, Samuel felt the decision before he understood it. His finger tightened, and the rifle answered with a crack that shattered the fragile silence. The sound rolled across the field like a slap, echoing against the hills. The lead German fell before the others even realized what had happened. Then confusion erupted. Shouts, movement, scattered return fire striking the dirt in frantic bursts. The Springfield's bolt slid back, smooth and clean. He chambered the next round without thought, his body moving in the rhythm he had taught it through nights of repair and repetition. The second shot took another soldier mid-stride, spinning him sideways. The third found its mark through a sliver of fog curling around a shattered stump. Each pull of the trigger felt like exhaling years of ridicule, every echo carving silence back into the world. By the time the Germans found cover, half of them were already on the ground. The rest fired wildly toward the ridge, bullets whining through the trees, snapping branches, sending bark into the air. Samuel pressed his cheek to the stock, his pulse steady despite the chaos. He fired again, and again. Each recoil came with the same perfect alignment, the same quiet conversation between man and weapon. Behind him, the platoon had opened up now, Garrons cracking in quick succession, machine guns roaring. The ridge became a storm of noise and dirt and smoke, and yet, amid it all, Samuel felt a strange clarity. He was no longer thinking about the jokes, or his father, or the fear that had lived under his ribs for months. He was only aware of the rifle and the distance, and the faint red bloom each time he found another mark. When the last German fell, the silence that followed seemed heavier than the gunfire. The smoke drifted low, curling through the leaves, mingling with the smell of gunpowder and sap. The ridge was secure, but no one spoke. Sergeant Cole walked up behind Samuel, breathing hard, his eyes tracing the open field now littered with still form. "How many?" Cole asked quietly. Samuel didn't answer it. He only stared through the scope one last time, at the motionless bodies, fading in. 12, he said finally, his voice low, almost detached. Before sunset. Cole looked at him for a long moment, then at the rifle resting across Samuel's knees. There was no mockery in his gaze now, no disbelief, only the unspoken acknowledgement between soldiers who had seen something that didn't need explaining. The rest of the platoon gathered slowly, glancing towards Samuel, and then away again, their faces uneasy. The jokes had died somewhere in that field, buried with the men who would never stand again. As night fell, and the first stars appeared, Samuel sat beside his rifle, running a cloth along the barrel with the same care he had always given it. The others kept their distance. The war was still far from over, but for the first time, no one doubted him. The Springfield gleamed faintly in the firelight, its scars catching the glow like old wounds healed by fire. That night, he slept with the rifle across his lap, not out of fear, but reverent. If you're reading this far, tell me where you're watching from. I want to know where this story finds you tonight, across all the quiet corners of the world. Morning returned as if nothing sacred had happened on that. The sun rose grey and low, its light diluted by drifting smoke that clung to the treetops like a ghost reluctant to leave. The field below was still, a shallow ocean of silence broken only by the rustle of crows landing among the fallen. Samuel Huxley stood there, rifle slung over his shoulder, boots sinking into the damp soil where 12 men had died the night before. The others had already begun the slow process of collecting dog tags, rolling bodies onto stretchers, muttering quiet fragments of prayer in languages the earth no longer cared to remember. But Samuel did not move to help. He stood at the edge of the slope, his face unreadable, eyes fixed on nothing. He thought, briefly, of the first man he had shot, the boy with the clean face, the one who had looked curious before the bullet took him. It wasn't pride he felt now, nor guilt, but a strange, hollow recognition, as though he had stepped into a story older than himself, one that men kept rewriting every generation with new uniforms and new names. He wondered if his father had felt the same way on some foreign field 2 decades earlier, standing over strangers, wondering which of them had been told the same lies about glory. Sergeant Cole called his name, snapping him from thought. "Huxley, command wants us moving by midday. Pack your gear." His voice was hard again, the tone of a man who knew emotion could kill faster than any bullet if left unchecked. Samuel nodded, turned, and began disassembling his position with quiet efficiency. He worked without speaking. The same deliberate patience he had shown in fixing the Springfield now turned toward burying what remained of yesterday. As they marched east through the forest, the men gave Samuel space. They talked among themselves in low voices, their words slipping into silence whenever he drew near. It wasn't contempt anymore. It was something heavier. Fear, perhaps. Respect, reluctantly given. They had all seen him fire, seen that impossible calm in his posture, the way each shot had found its target with mechanical grace. It wasn't natural, they whispered. It wasn't luck either. Some said he'd made a deal with death itself. Others claimed the Springfield wasn't repaired at all, but cursed, its flaws turned into something terrible and precise. Samuel ignored it all. Superstition was easier for them than understanding. That evening, they reached a ruined farmhouse on the edge of a burned orchard. The air smelled of wet ash and decay. The place had been shelled months earlier, and the walls still bore the scars, holes the size of fists, soot rising from blackened beams. The platoon set up for the night, stacking crates, clearing debris, posting sentries along the road. Samuel found a corner where the light from a broken window fell across the floor in long, trembling shapes. He sat there, cleaning his rifle. It had become ritual, the only thing that kept the edges of his thoughts from unraveling. Cole approached after sunset. He stood quietly for a moment before speaking. "You did well yesterday," he said, his voice stripped of its usual authority. "I'll be putting your name in for a commendation. Might do you some good when this is over." Samuel didn't look up. "It's never over," he said softly, his hands still moving along the length of the rifle. Cole studied him, uncertain. "You mean the war?" Samuel shook his head. "No. What comes after?" The sergeant didn't answer. He had seen that look before. Men who had crossed some invisible border, whose hearts would never fully return to where they had started. After a long silence, he patted Samuel's shoulder once and left him alone. The night passed with distant thunder that wasn't thunder. Artillery rumbled somewhere far off, turning the horizon into flashes of brief daylight. Samuel barely slept. When dawn came, he found himself walking the orchard, the trees skeletal and charred. Amid the ashes, he noticed a single apple still clinging to a blackened branch, its skin half burnt but intact. He plucked it and turned it in his hand, the absurdity of it striking him. Life's insistence, even here. The platoon received new orders by noon. Push forward, link up with another company along the river, secure a crossing before the Germans regrouped. Another march, another hill, another nameless point on a map that meant nothing to the men dying to reach it. As they moved, Samuel's Springfield hung across his back, the barrel dark with oil and memory. The forest thinned into open country again, and the familiar sound of engines began to rise, a low, distant growl like thunder under the earth. "Armor," someone muttered. The column halted. Ahead, faint figures moved along the ridge. German infantry, perhaps 40 strong, supported by a half-track crawling along the road like a metal insect. Cole gave quick orders, his voice cutting through the panic. "Dig in, form a firing line, wait for the signal." But Samuel was already moving to higher ground. He climbed a small embankment, finding a vantage point between 2 crumbling stone walls. He could see everything now, the columns advancing, their movement methodical, efficient, inevitable. He lay prone, the Springfield steady in his hands, his cheek resting against the cool wood. The air smelled of rain and smoke and something like iron. He chambered around, exhaled slowly, and waited. When the first American machine gun opened up, chaos bloomed across the field. The Germans scattered for cover, shouting, returning fire in bursts that tore through branches and sent soil spraying skyward. Samuel fired once, the recoil pressing against his shoulder, and another soldier went down. He fired again, adjusting slightly for wind. Each shot found its place, each target collapsing as though the bullet had been waiting for them all along. But this time, the fight was different. The enemy was stronger, their fire more precise. Bullets tore the stone around him, splintering the wall into dust. He could hear Cole shouting below, could hear the desperate rhythm of men fighting to hold the line. Still, Samuel stayed where he was, firing until the rifle grew hot in his hands, until the echo of each shot blurred into a single unending roar. And when the half-track's machine gun finally found his position, when the ground around him exploded into fragments of rock and bone, Samuel rolled behind the wall, heart hammering, smoke in his lungs. The Springfield lay beside him, still intact, its stock scarred and beautiful in the dim light. He whispered something, maybe a prayer, maybe a promise, and waited for the next chance to stand again. Because for men like Samuel Huxley, the war did not take everything all at once. It came in pieces, like the slow unthreading of a life that refused to surrender. If you've stayed with me through this far, you might consider subscribing. It helps these stories reach more people who still believe in quiet courage and flawed men who keep fighting anyway. The rain came that night like penance. It fell in steady sheets, turning the earth to mud and the air to steam, muting the sound of distant gunfire until the world seemed to breathe in slow, wounded. The platoon had dug in along the ridge, exhausted and bloodied, their uniforms soaked, their nerves stretched thin. The half-track had been destroyed by a lucky shell, but the cost had been high. 3 men gone, 2 more barely clinging to life. The rest sat in silence beneath ponchos and broken trees, their eyes hollow. Samuel Huxley crouched near the remains of a stone wall, his Springfield across his knees. The rain had washed most of the soot from its barrel, leaving thin veins of rust forming in places he had once polished clean. His hands moved automatically, wiping, oiling, inspecting, though he knew it made little difference. It wasn't about function anymore. It was ritual, the same way a man might trace the face of a photograph long after the person in it was gone. The rifle was not just a weapon. It was memory. It was identity. It was proof that something he touched still obeyed him in a world that no longer made sense. Sergeant Cole came over, limping slightly, his face drawn tight with exhaustion. He stood for a moment without speaking, just listening to the steady rhythm of rain striking metal. "Orders came through," he said finally. "We're pulling back at dawn. Command wants the ridge abandoned. Too costly to hold." Samuel looked up, expressionless. "So all this," he murmured, glancing toward the dark field below. "For nothing." Cole exhaled heavily. "For now. That's how it goes. We take a hill, lose a hill, take it again next week. Doesn't matter. What matters is that you and the rest of the boys stay alive long enough to see the end of it." The end. The word felt hollow in Samuel's mouth. He had stopped believing in endings the first time he'd seen a man still breathing after losing half his chest, still whispering prayers to a God who didn't seem to listen. There were no ends, only pauses between different kinds of pain. When Cole left, Samuel sat alone, staring into the rain. The world beyond the ridge blurred into grey, a watercolour of fog, smoke, and distant fires. He thought again of the 12 men he had killed, their faces already fading into abstraction. He wondered if somewhere across the field, their comrades were counting him the same way. Another ghost to be remembered in curses whispered through teeth clenched against grief. He didn't sleep. He just waited for dawn, the Springfield warm against his chest. At first light, they began the retreat. The rain had softened the ground so completely that every step pulled at their boots like a living thing, trying to drag them back. They moved in silence, weapons slung, eyes darting toward the tree line. The forest seemed endless, filled with the ghosts of every battle that had ever been fought there. Birds rose from the canopy in sudden flurries, startled by something none of them could see. Halfway through the withdrawal, the first shot cracked from somewhere to the right. It wasn't random. It was measured, precise. Then another, closer. Cole's voice cut through the confusion, ordering the men to ground, to return fire, to find cover. But the forest was a trap. The Germans had waited, letting them abandon the high ground, letting them step into the perfect kill zone. Samuel hit the dirt, rolled behind a fallen log, and scanned the slope. Through the mist, Movement, helmet flashes, muzzle bursts, shadows weaving through the trees. He raised the Springfield, sighted carefully, and fired. The recoil slammed against his shoulder, grounding him in the chaos. Another shot, then another. Each found a target, but the enemy kept coming. Cole crawled up beside him, shouting over the din. "We're cut off! We have to break through to the East Road." Samuel nodded. They moved together, crawling, sliding through mud, bullets hissing past like hornets. One of the men ahead went down, a spray of red against the wet bark. Samuel didn't stop. He couldn't. The world had narrowed to one purpose: survive, protect, repeat. They reached a shallow stream, the cold water biting at their legs as they waded across. Behind them, the fight raged on. The Germans were relentless, their shouts blending with the thunder of artillery that had begun to fall again. Cole slipped on the rocks, went down hard, his rifle lost to the current. Samuel turned back, grabbed him under the arm, dragged him forward even as bullets tore through the water. By the time they reached the far bank, Cole was bleeding from a gash across his temple. Samuel pressed a hand to the wound, forcing pressure, but the sergeant pushed him away. "Keep moving," he rasped. "Don't stop for me." Samuel's jaw tightened. "Not leaving you." Cole tried to smile, a grim twist of his mouth. "Didn't think you would." They stumbled on together until the forest thinned into open ground again. The rain had eased, replaced by mist that clung low and heavy. In the distance, faintly, Samuel could see the outline of an abandoned farmhouse, their only chance of shelter. They reached it minutes later, bursting through the splintered doorway. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old smoke and mold. Samuel set Cole down against the wall, then moved to the window, scanning the tree line. He could hear the enemy closing in, boots crunching on wet leaves, voices carried faintly by the wind. He checked the Springfield, 5 rounds left. He wiped rain from his eyes and took position at the window. Cole tried to speak, but Samuel silenced him with a glance. "Rest," he said quietly. "I'll handle this." Outside, the first German appeared, moving cautiously through the fog. Samuel waited, patient, heartbeat steady. When the man stepped into the open, the Springfield spoke. The sound echoed through the hollow room, like thunder inside a coffin. Another came, then another. Samuel fired until the bolt clicked empty, each shot deliberate, each breath controlled. By the time the silence returned, 6 shapes lay scattered in the mud. Samuel lowered the rifle, chest heaving. He turned to check on Cole, but the sergeant was still, his eyes half closed, breath faint as a candle in wind. Samuel knelt beside him, his hands shaking for the first time. He pressed 2 fingers to Cole's throat, felt the faint pulse flicker and fade. He stayed like that for a long moment, rain dripping through the roof, pooling around them both. Outside, the forest had gone quiet again, but Samuel knew it wasn't over. It was never over, and so he reloaded, his hands steady once more. Because men like Samuel Huxley didn't fight for medals or maps. They fought because something inside them demanded to see the world endure, no matter how much of themselves they had to burn away to make it happen. The morning after the firefight dawned pale and brittle, the sky an endless wash of grey that seemed to press down on the ruined farmhouse, like the weight of the war itself. Smoke hung low over the valley, the kind that never truly cleared, just shifted and settled elsewhere. Samuel Huxley sat by the cold hearth, the Springfield resting upright against his knee, its metal darkened by soot and rain. He hadn't slept, not since the last German fell, and the silence returned like a punishment. Sergeant Cole's body lay on a torn canvas near the door, his face covered by a damp field blanket. There were no words left for him, no prayers Samuel knew how to speak. Outside, the wind carried faint echoes, distant explosions, the rumble of armor, the murmuring rhythm of men moving toward yet another nameless place on the map. The war was still breathing, just beyond the hills. It always was. Samuel watched the window, waiting for the light to shift, for some sign that the world beyond this small ruin hadn't ended completely. But the day held itself still, like a photograph of despair. He found himself listening to the small, human sound, the ticking of the metal cooling, the occasional flutter of a bird somewhere beyond the rubble. It was strange, he thought, how quickly life returned to places where men had died. The earth was indifferent. It swallowed everything, blood and courage alike. At noon, he buried Cole behind the house, digging through the wet soil until his hands blistered. He found an old wooden beam and carved a crude cross with his bayonet. It was not enough, but it was all he had. When it was done, he stood for a long time beside the grave, the rifle hanging from his shoulder, the wind tugging at his coat. "Rest easy, Sarge," he murmured, voice hoarse. "You held the line." He didn't cry. There were no tears left in him, only the familiar ache that lived where grief and exhaustion met. By mid-afternoon, the distant thunder of engines returned, this time American. He stepped out onto the muddy road, signaling with the barrel of his rifle raised high. A convoy emerged through the fog, 2 jeeps, an armored car, and a half-track marked with white stars already dulled by dust. The lead jeep slowed, and a young lieutenant climbed out, barely older than Samuel had been when he enlisted. His uniform was immaculate, his eyes too clear for what he was walking into. "You from Cole's platoon?" the lieutenant asked. Samuel nodded. "What's left of it?" The officer's face fell slightly. "Command's been trying to reach you for 2 days. We thought you were gone." "Most of us are," Samuel said flatly. The lieutenant hesitated, searching for words, then motioned toward the jeep. "We're pushing north to the river. You'll ride with us. Debrief later." Samuel glanced back toward the farmhouse one last time. The cross behind it stood crooked in the rain. Then he nodded and climbed into the jeep, the Springfield across his lap. The road north wound through valleys scarred by shellfire and lined with trees stripped bare by winter's approach. Villages passed by, empty shells of stone and memory. In one, the remains of a church still stood, its steeple cracked, its bell lying half buried in the mud. Every turn of the wheels carried them deeper into the heart of what felt like the world's slowest dying. By dusk, they reached the river crossing. Engineers were already at work constructing a temporary bridge, their silhouettes moving against the glow of truck lights. The air smelled of oil, sweat, and the faint sweetness of decay. Samuel disembarked, stretching his legs, feeling the stiffness in his shoulders and spine. The lieutenant approached again. "You'll be assigned to Able Company for now," he said. "They're short on marksmen." Samuel looked at the faintest hint of irony touching his voice. Marksman, that what they're calling it now? The officer frowned, unsure whether it was sarcasm or pain. "You've got a reputation, Huxley. Men talk. 12 Germans in one day, maybe more since. You could do some real good out here." Samuel almost smiled, though the expression didn't reach his eyes. "Good," he repeated softly. "Haven't heard that word in a while." That night, as he sat by the riverbank with the Springfield beside him, he watched the water move under the bridge lights, slow, relentless, carrying with it the ashes of everything the war had broken. He thought of his father again, of the missing fingers, the quiet anger that had lived behind his eye. He understood it now, that silence. The war never really ended for men like them. It only went quiet long enough for the memories to find their voice again. Somewhere upriver, artillery thundered. The sound rolled down the valley, shaking the bridge, vibrating through the ground into his bones. He checked the bolt of his rifle, the movement so automatic it felt like breathing. It was a comfort, the last piece of control he had left. The next morning, orders came quickly, a forward patrol, a small team to scout the far bank where German forces had been spotted regrouping. Samuel volunteered without hesitation. The lieutenant didn't argue. The crossing was cold, the river biting at their legs as they waded through. On the other side, the world felt different, quieter, emptier, as if all sound had been swallowed by the forest. The patrol moved slowly, 5 men in staggered formation, every footstep deliberate. Birds scattered once, then nothing, only the whisper of wind through trees stripped bare of leaves. Then, movement, a flash of grey, a glint of metal. The crack of a rifle split the stillness. The man beside Samuel fell instantly, his helmet rolling down the slope. The others dove for cover, returning fire blindly. Samuel pressed himself against a tree, scanning, searching for the source. Then he saw it, a faint muzzle flash from the ruins of a small barn ahead. He steadied the Springfield, adjusted for distance, and fired. The first shot missed, hitting the wall. The second didn't. The sniper fell, and the forest went silent again. The patrol regrouped, hearts hammering, breath clouding in the cold. Samuel lowered his rifle, feeling the tremor in his hands. He wasn't sure anymore if it was from the adrenaline or the slow realization that every life he took was carving something permanent into his own. As they moved back toward the river, the lieutenant caught his eye. "Good shot, Huxley." Samuel gave no reply. He just walked on, the Springfield cradled close, the echo of that single shot lingering in the hollow spaces of his mind. The river ahead shimmered faintly under the morning sun, indifferent, endless. He wondered how many more crossings like this he'd survive, how many more faces he'd have to forget to keep his hands steady, because in the end, it wasn't bravery that kept him alive. It was the quiet, stubborn refusal to die before the rifle was finally silent. By the time winter settled fully across Europe, the land itself seemed to recoil from the memory of all it had endured. The forests stood skeletal, their branches webbed with frost. Rivers froze at their edges, flowing sluggishly like veins thick with sorrow. And the men who still fought beneath those bleak skies carried the same brittle stillness in their bone. Private Samuel Huxley had become part of that landscape, one of its silent figures, a shadow in a world made entirely of grey and smoke. He had long stopped counting the days. Each sunrise was a rumour, each sunset a mercy. The war had become a rhythm: march, dig, fight, retreat, repeat. The Springfield was the only thing that hadn't changed. Its wood darkened with oil and sweat, the bolt worn smooth from endless use. The rifle had survived longer than most of the men he'd shared rations with. Some joked that it was luck, others said it was cursed. Samuel knew it was neither. It was persistence, the kind that refused to break even when it should. The company was camped along a frozen river, their tents patched with canvas and their fires burning low to avoid drawing attention. The enemy was near, close enough that at night they could hear German voices drifting faintly across the ice. Laughter sometimes, like echoes from another life. It was almost worse than the fighting. One evening, as Samuel sat cleaning his rifle by the dim glow of a lantern, a young soldier named Blake approached. He couldn't have been older than 19, his face still carrying the softness of someone who hadn't yet seen what the war truly was. "You're Huxley, right?" asked hesitant. "The guy from Hill 43, the one with the Springfield." Samuel didn't look up. "That's me." Blake crouched beside him, shivering slightly. "They say you dropped 12 krauts in one day, alone." Samuel's hands stilled for a moment on the cleaning rod, then resumed their motion. "People say a lot of things." Blake hesitated. "How'd you do it?" Samuel wiped the bolt, inspecting it in the flickering light. "By aiming," he said simply. The boy laughed nervously, waiting for more, but Samuel said nothing else. There was nothing to explain. Killing wasn't a skill, it was a state of being. Either you learned to quiet everything inside you until the world narrowed to a single breath and a heartbeat, or you didn't survive long enough to learn. Later that night, when the wind rose and the temperature dropped, the camp fell into uneasy silence. Samuel lay awake, listening to the ice crack and shift along the riverbank. Somewhere in the dark, a flare went up, green light slicing through the night. Then came the sound he'd been waiting for, though he hadn't wanted it, the metallic chatter of German machine gun. "Positions!" someone shouted. Chaos ignited. Men scrambled for cover, rifles clattering, boots slipping on frozen mud, the air filled with the snapping whip of bullets, the sharp, distant bark of mortars. Samuel grabbed his rifle and moved through the smoke, calm amid the frenzy. His world contracted again, his breathing slow, the chaos becoming distant noise. He found a vantage point beside a collapsed truck, steadied the Springfield across the twisted metal, and began to fire. The bolt moved with the same perfect rhythm it always had. Aim, breathe, squeeze, eject. Men fell in the snow like marionettes with cut strings. Blake was beside him now, firing wildly, eyes wide with terror. Samuel reached over, forced the boy's barrel lower. "Slow," he said quietly. "Make them count." The fight lasted nearly an hour. When it ended, the field was scattered with dark shapes, and silence returned in heavy waves. Blake was trembling, his hands streaked with dirt and blood that wasn't his own. "We held them off," he said, almost laughing, his voice edged with disbelief. Samuel didn't answer. He was looking down at his rifle, at the frost forming along the edges of its barrel. It gleamed in the starlight, beautiful and terrible all at once. In the days that followed, word of the skirmish spread through the ranks. Men began to treat Samuel differently. They gave him space, yes, but also a strange, reverent kind of trust. In their eyes, he had become something beyond ordinary, a relic of precision, a reminder that even in chaos, there were men who could still make order out of violence. But Samuel didn't feel like a hero. Each battle left him quieter, more distant, his thoughts drifting further from the men around him. He stopped writing letters home. There was nothing left to say. The only thing that remained real was the rifle in his hand and the endless wintry silence that followed each shot. One morning, as dawn broke pale and colourless over the frozen camp, the lieutenant handed him new orders. "We're advancing on a supply depot near the town of Elsenborn. They want you on overwatch." Samuel nodded, took his rifle, and walked toward the line without another word. The snow crunched under his boots. His breath rose in clouds that disappeared into the same grey horizon he had been chasing since the beginning. The rifle rested easily in his hands, its weight familiar and absolute, because by now, he wasn't fighting for victory anymore. He was fighting for the silence that came after. The silence where a man could still breathe and remember who he once was before the world turned to ash.